Well, this is, I guess, a propitious time to be doing this, but as Harriet said, this program was planned before the fire. And several people have asked me, well, is this going to be about the fire? And I said, no, this is about the history of Butler Island. And that's kind of like the way we planned it. And this, goodness gracious, I've got competition. We'll zoom through this. Hopefully we won't have a power outage. But I have been researching the history of Butler Island and really the whole Altamaha Delta for many years, since I was working at the Darien News with the Williamson family, and I got engaged by the county commissioners to write a formal official history of McIntosh County back in the late 80s, and that's when I really started to getting into the Butler Island story. And I was fortunate enough to have as my early mentors people like Malcolm Bell Jr., who wrote the definitive history of the Butler family and made his friendship, and he supported me and helped me a lot with the background on the Butler family and their descendants down through 5 generations of ownership of Butler Island and the plantation called Hampton on St. Simon's. So anyway, this is sort of an overview. It doesn't focus on any one thing. We'll be touching on the early history of the human use of Butler Island through the plantation. We'll go into the years after the Civil War. We'll talk about slavery. We'll talk about the weeping time a little bit. We'll get into the Houston era and that sort of thing and try to bring it on up to the present, to where we are now.
You didn't tell them about my people.
Oh, I'll get to that. Yes, ma'am. I will. I promise. I never forget your people. It's Miss Eunice Moore, who is a descendant of a Butler Island slave, and I've got a picture. In fact, this picture right there is Miss Eunice Moore's ancestor. His name is Habersham Mungeon, born a slave on Butler Island in the 1850s. So we'll get into that a little bit more. Also on the cover of my book about the history of Butler Island. That shows you how much respect I have for Miss Eunice and all of the descendants of the people of Butler Island. Major Pierce Butler was an Irishman who joined the English Army, the British Army, came to America as a young man in 1764 to Charleston, then known as Charlestown. And Major Butler was in the King's Regiment. And while there, this was, of course, before the Revolution, the American Revolution, and he had the good fortune to meet and then eventually marry a daughter of one of the wealthiest plantation owners in all of the South Carolina colony. Now, her name was Mary Middleton. And so you had the merger of the Butler and the Middleton families there in Charleston right before the Revolution. And the Middletons were great supporters of the cause of independence, and as a consequence, so was Major Butler. And he resigned his position in the British Army and supported the cause of independence in America. And that was a very fortunate thing for him to do, because had the independence effort failed, Major Butler would have lost everything as a result of the wealth that he had married into with the Middleton family. But anyway, Butler, after the Revolution, became a representative to the framers in Philadelphia of the Constitution, and he was involved in the framing of the Constitution, one of the delegates from South Carolina, and he was in Philadelphia, and eventually he and Mary made their permanent home in Philadelphia. Major Butler never lived on Butler Island, nor did any of his descendants live on Butler Island, except for occasional inspection tours or visits. Now, this is one thing I've tried to clear up in some of the older histories, that the Butler family never lived there and were never there more than a few weeks at any time. But while he was in Philadelphia, it was at the time he began assembling his Georgia properties. He bought Butler Island. In 1785, he bought a tract of land on the north end of St. Simon's Island, which he called Hampton, and that was a plantation. So he had 2 large plantations within equal distance, very close to distance to each other. And so he had these properties, but he continued to live in Philadelphia and worked with the Constitutional Convention Butler was one of those who decided, because of the issue of slavery in the South, in the newly independent United States, Butler was one of those who decided on the language in the Constitution that determined that slave people were only 3/5 of a person, would be counted in the census as 3/5 of a person rather than a full person, like the owners were. So that's one of the anomalies of Major Butler. That was one of the things that he was involved. And the earlier original language of the Constitution states that for census and counting purposes, for counting the population, slaves in the South would be counted as 3/5 of a person. And there's specific language there in the Constitution. Some of you may be familiar with that. The Georgia coast, the low country of Georgia, was highly conducive to plantation agriculture through methods adopted from South Carolina before the Revolution. Rice growing techniques in the low country of South Carolina and Georgia became the most profitable plantation enterprise that a planter could engage in. And you can see here the rivers. These are river systems coming in from the interior, and all of these freshwater rivers come down to the sea, and here are the barrier islands. And you've got the Savannah, the Ogeechee, the Altamaha, the Satilla, and the St. Mary's. What's this? Okefenokee. Right, that's the swamp. The largest swamp in the United States, Okefenokee. St. Mary's River comes out of that and flows into the Atlantic just south of Cumberland Island. But Butler wanted to plant rice because he had been around rice planting with the Middletons before the Revolution. So he wanted to plant rice, but he got Hampton Plantation on St. Simon's for the purpose of cultivating cotton. So the barrier islands were very conducive to the production of cotton, both short staple and long staple Sea Island cotton, because of the soils were highly conducive to growing cotton, dry, moist, very permeable soils. But the river plantations were where the rice was grown, and Butler Island was a prime example of that. I'll show it to you better. Here's Hampton, just across the marsh from Cannon's Point. Those are the two northernmost plantations on St. Simon's, and then Butler Island would be right over in there somewhere. It's not shown on the map, but they're very close by water. And the cotton was grown at Hampton. So Butler, at one time, had a huge slave force. He really moved all of his slaves from South Carolina to his two Georgia properties. And at one time in the 1820s, Butler was the largest slave owner in all of Georgia, had almost 1,000 slaves. Huge slave force. And those were about equally distributed between Hampton and Butler Island. Both plantations were very profitable, but the money, the real money, was at Butler Island, where the rice was grown. And he had about 1,500 acres under cultivation in rice at Butler Island. Well, as I said, Major Butler and his wife, Mary Middleton Butler, lived in Philadelphia. That was their permanent residence now. But he had to have somebody run things for him here in Georgia. And this is where Roswell King comes in. Roswell King had migrated to Georgia from Connecticut right after the Revolution, he and two of his brothers, Reuben and Thomas. And Roswell King Sr. became the manager of the two Butler Island plantations, the resident manager for the two plantations, and he lived at Hampton. His house and his family was at Hampton, and they built a tabby house there at Hampton Point, but he also, of course, supervised what was going on at Butler Island. He was not a real nice fellow. From all the research that I've done on him, he was a very hard taskmaster. He was not the fair-minded slave manager such as you see in later people such as Thomas Spalding and Richard James Arnold and James Hamilton Cooper, who were much more liberal with their slave management than people like the Butlers and Roswell King, and then later his son Roswell Jr. But anyway, Roswell was the plantation manager. He would write weekly letters back to Major Butler in Philadelphia reporting on the status of the crops and the yields of the rice and the amounts of cotton that was being harvested in the picking season. This is sort of a satellite view of Butler Island. You can see it from way up in the air. This is Butler Island right here. And you can just see, this is a modern day picture, but you can see the network of rice canals. The plantation operated by a system of hydrology. Fresh water coming from upstream in the Altamaha would flood the rice fields, and then it would be closed off. So the rice fields would have fresh water standing on them while the rice began to germinate. The seed began to germinate. And then later the water would be drained off. They would have 4 floodings and 4 drainings on a typical season of rice growing. The seed would be planted usually in March after the last frost had gone, and the rice would be staggered plantings. It wouldn't all be planted at one time. It would be planted in increments in the squares of the rice. These are all rice squares, and all of the plantations operated pretty much the same way. But King would plant 2 or 3 squares, say in mid to late March, 2 or 3 more in early April, 2 or 3 more later in April, until he had the whole tract called all under bank, which means the rice is in, the seed is in, and now the process of cultivation has begun. It's a typical scene from a Georgia rice plantation. This particular engraving was done from a plantation on the Ogeechee River south of Savannah, but it typifies the plantation cultivation process, where you have usually the women slaves would be in the rice fields doing the weeding and the hoeing and the removal of birds that would eat the rice shoots, and these shoots are very delicate, so they had to have constant attention to keep the animals and the birds away from the rice shoots as they came up. Here's a good watercolor of a couple of rice squares intersected by canals. And in fact, you can go to Butler Island or any of these other places and see remnants of these rice canals all along. And of course, these were the tide gates that they would raise and lower. When the field was flooded, they would have to lower the tide gates in order to keep the salt water out when the tide came back in. So this thing worked on a 6-hour tidal cycle. Fresh water coming in downstream on an ebbing tide fills the fields, shut the tide gates. 6 hours later, the tide starts coming in again. It's been this way for ages, forever. But they can't let the salt water get into the fields. It would kill the rice crop if they did. There was harvesting machinery, threshing machinery, boats plying along the various rivers to transport the rice crops to the larger markets. At Butler Island, there was, of course, a rice mill. Major Butler had his own rice apparatus there to thresh the rice and pound the rice. And when you pound the rice, you're removing the hulls from the kernels of the rice to get the final process, what they call clean rice. That's the white rice that you would buy in a store. Clean rice is white rice. And a pounding mill would get it down to that process. And if a planter could afford his own mill, then his profits would be even higher when he marketed his clean rice in Savannah or in Charleston. If a planter didn't have his own rice mill, he would have to contract it with somebody like Roswell King at Butler Island, or maybe a factor in Savannah to do the pounding. Pounding equipment was exceedingly expensive. This is an early map of the Darien area that you can see. Darien, of course, in the various islands. This is Butler Island here. You got General's Island there between Darien and Butler Island. So we, of course, travel these roads every day going back and forth to Brunswick for one thing or another. And you can look off to the left and the right and see vestiges of these rice fields. It's very, very prominent. There was about 650 slaves at Butler Island during the peak of these operations in the 1840s, early 1850s. And as I said, Habersham Mungin was one of those. And he's shown here in General's Cut with one of his grandsons. Habersham Mungin was born a slave at Butler Island, and he lived well into the 20th century. This particular photograph was taken in 1915. By a visitor to this area from Massachusetts who was doing some research on Fanny Kimball. And so she took various pictures of some of the former freed slaves who were still living and some of their activities. General's Cut, which links Darien with Butler Island by water, was actually done by Major Butler. Here's General's Cut. Before Major Butler came, there was no cut here. And so the only way to get from Darien to Butler Island, you had to go a roundabout way and then loop back down on the Butler River. But Major Butler said, well, I'm going to have my slaves dig a hole or a trench through the marsh, about a half a mile, maybe a little more, to link the Darien River with the Butler River. And so they had a cut, which is still in use in the present day. Shrimpers use them, recreational boaters use General's Cut. And that's it. You can see how the cut looked there in 1915 in the background of Habersham Mungin. Major Butler died in 1822. He stipulated in his will that he was leaving his Georgia properties. He had a son. He and Mary had a son, Thomas, but he was sort of like left out of the will. There was a lot of friction there between the major and his son. So the will stipulated that all of the Georgia properties, including the slaves and all the plantation infrastructure, would be left to the two grandsons of the sons of his daughter Frances Butler. Mays, Frances married a Philadelphian named Mays, M-E-A-S-E. She had two sons, John and Pierce, as shown here. Pierce, of course, named for his grandfather, Major Pierce Butler. The stipulation was in the will by the major, says the two brothers, the Mays brothers, can inherit the properties, but the stipulation was that they changed their surnames to Butler, which they had no trouble doing. They said, yeah, all this land and all of these people, and yeah. So they changed I think about 1830, when they reached their majority of age 21, changed their surnames to Butler. And so hence Pierce Mays Butler and his brother John Mays Butler. During this time, right before the major died, there was some trouble at Butler Island and at Hampton Point because of the War of 1812. And Roswell King made this grievous error of allowing about 90 slaves of the plantations to be taken off St. Simon's Island by the British right at the end of the War of 1812. This was in early 1815. Major Butler was infuriated that he had lost 90 slaves. He thought his manager, Roswell King, should have done more to defend the plantation against the British incursion. They did the same thing on Jekyll. They did the same thing on Cumberland. So a lot of the slaves were freed by the British at 3 islands. During that very end of the War of 1812, they were taken to Newfoundland, to Halifax, and where they were given their freedom. But the major fired Roswell, said, this is just too much. You've cost me a lot of money. So Roswell King was fired by the major just before Major died. But as he was going out the door, the major said, well, can you recommend somebody to take over as manager of my Georgia plantations? And of course, Roswell said, well, my son, Roswell Jr., will do a good job for you. And so, perforce, Major Butler hired Roswell King Jr. to manage the plantations, who was even worse than his father in his management of slaves. Very hard taskmaster. Jr. left the employ of the major, went on to become a prosperous sawmill owner in Darien, an officer of the very powerful Bank of Darien, which financed the North Georgia gold fields in the 1820s. Roswell King Sr. made several trips to North Georgia to supervise the management of the financing of borrowers for gold and mining gold in North Georgia. And while he was there, he decided he liked North Georgia a lot more climate friendly than the Georgia coast. So he decided to stay, moved his family and a lot of his friends, and founded the town of Roswell, just north of present-day Atlanta. This was in 1838 that Roswell was founded by Roswell King, and a number of coastal Georgia people migrated there with Roswell, and it was sort of a migrating community from the coast to what was then Cobb County, to Roswell. So that was a big deal. And so you go to Roswell now and just see a lot of evidence of coastal culture there. Early homes that were built by coastal people in Roswell in the 1840s. So there's a lot of tradition there with Roswell. Still is. Like his grandfather, Pierce and John, the two brothers, lived in Philadelphia full time. They were never residents of Butler Island or Hampton, except for occasional visits to inspect things and to check on progress. So Pierce M. Butler was living in Philadelphia in 1834 when he met this young woman, Frances Ann Kimball. She was an English woman who had come to America with her father on a Shakespearean acting tour. She was an actress or an interpreter of the works of Shakespeare. Very, very popular, very, very gifted, extremely intelligent, very literate. And Fanny Kimball came to Georgia, and of course she took the east coast of America by storm. Just everybody loved her. And so she came to America, met Pierce M. Butler, and they fell in love, and a year or two later got married. What you have to know about Fanny Kimball and her family, the whole Kimball family back in England, was that they were extreme abolitionists. They were very, very anti-slavery. In fact, Mr. Kimball, I think, made speeches in the English Parliament, the House of Commons, espousing the evils of slavery. So Fanny Kimball comes to America and marries the largest slave owner in Georgia. Go figure. Historians have never quite come to terms with how that happened. John Scott, in his introduction to the Fanny Kimball Journal that he did in 1961, John Scott theorizes in his introduction that the Kimball family was hard up for cash. They were struggling financially. And so you marry into a family like the Butlers, who were really rich by those standards of that day, prominent Philadelphians. And so by doing that, Fanny and her father probably got very quick solvency. That was his theory, may well very be. Nobody has been able to exactly pin that down. Nonetheless, they married, and she is a beautiful woman, just a lovely woman. They were both about the same age. They were both born about 1810, so when they married, they would have been in their, like, maybe their mid to late 20s. They had two daughters, two lovely daughters, Sarah and Frances. Frances being named for Pierce's mother, Frances Butler, Mays. So they had the two daughters. All of you are familiar with, there's just been a tremendous amount of literature about Fanny Kimball and her writings about Georgia and her acting career in the United Kingdom and in North America. She was a very well-known, very popular woman, and so she's been really researched and written about, and we owe her a debt for providing modern people in our later generations to the present a clearer understanding of slave conditions at Butler Island, because she was there on hand and she made her observations. She wrote them down. She interviewed people, the slave workers on Butler Island and at Hampton Point. She documented everything she saw, and she was appalled. Naturally, she would be. This was during a brief visit to Georgia she made with her husband. They brought their 2 daughters. Sarah was 3. Frances Fan was 1.5 when they came to Georgia in 1838, 1839. Okay? But they stayed at Butler Island for several weeks, then went over to Hampton Point for several weeks. But the whole time they were here, she wrote everything down, talked to a lot of people, engaged with the slave force, attended slave funerals, saw how they lived and ate, and learned about the culture. And she documented all of this in her famous journal that came to be published later on. She observed things like, the slaves loading the freighting schooners to take rice to the bigger markets. There was an overseer's house on Butler Island that Fanny and Pierce and the 2 girls stayed while they were at Butler Island, the old overseer's house. She documented the complex. Because of her journal, we now know where things were. Things that are no longer there, but thanks to the journal we now know. Such as the location of the slave settlements on Butler Island. There were 4 of them. 3 of them were along the Champney River, close proximity to the majority of the rice fields. Another slave settlement was in the area where the brick chimney is now, and where the Houston house was later built. That was slave settlement number 1. The overseer's house. This is the landing, the overseer's house, the rice mill steam chimney. You see that? The main landing, General's Cut. But in her journal, how many of you read the journal? I bet a lot of you have. Well, if you haven't read it, get it. It's in print. It's a really good read. It's interesting. It's not a dull, dry story. Because Fanny not only is she an accomplished actress, but she was so literate, she's also an accomplished author. She really knew how to put things into words. And not just her descriptions of the plantation, she captured the beauty of the Georgia coast in a lot of her writing in the journal, documenting the landscape and the waterscape of the tidal rivers and the marshes and the oaks and the beaches. She recorded all of these things and described them vividly. And she always felt that coastal Georgia was one of the most beautiful places she'd ever been, except for the stain of slavery when she was here. All plantations had rotation crops. On Butler Island, there was a certain amount of acreage, probably 100 acres or so, devoted to the cultivation of sugarcane. And Major Butler and Roswell King operated a sugar mill, and this is the brick remnants of it, taken a long time ago. This is not a recent picture, obviously. But they had a sugar mill where they boiled sugar juice and then shipped it off to Savannah to be made into sugar. I don't think they actually processed sugar at Butler Island, but they cut the cane and boiled the juice and then shipped it off to the bigger markets for manufacture into sugar. But a rotation crop is something that you sort of supplement your main crop with. In Butler Island's case, it would be rice, but the rotation crop would be sugarcane. And occasionally, Major Butler said, well, let's try some cotton too, even though the soil is so moist. Cotton doesn't adapt well to really wet, marshy, wet soils. But they did. They found enough high ground on Butler Island, on the backside of the island, where they actually cultivated a little bit of cotton once in a while, even though that was never the money crop as far as Butler Island was concerned. This is one of the most evocative pictures. I've used this picture in all of my books. In fact, it's been on the cover of some of my books. This picture was taken on Sapelo around 1920, but it typifies the use of pounding rice for domestic use. the mother and her child are standing there, and she is pounding rice, not for commercial purposes, but for home use on Sapelo. They actually grew a little rice on Sapelo, not much. But this picture sort of, like the picture of Habersham Mungeon a little while ago, it sort of typifies that whole situation with the feel of, you know, who they were and where they were. The slave houses, this is a picture actually at Tybee Island. You see the Tybee Lighthouse on the right. But I use this picture because the slave cabin there is very similar to what would have been built at Butler Island. It would have been a brick tabby chimney and then a pine frame cottage with a pine shingle roof. And that's exactly what they would have had at Butler Island, based on some of the archaeology that's been done there by Teresa Singleton and others. So I like that picture because, of course, none of that's there now. There's some little bit of brick rubble at some of the slave settlements where they found evidence of chimneys and that sort of thing, but they could not use regular tabby that we associate tabby on the barrier islands because the soil was too moist and damp. It would not support heavy tabby. It would sink. So therefore, the tabby was used on the drier soils of the islands in the mainland, but they'd use brick and pine lumber to build their houses on the rice tracks. Darien was the shipping center for a lot of the rice and cotton grown around here before the war between the states. As I said, some plantations had their own vessels, like the Butlers had their own vessel called the Roswell King that would transport their cotton commodities and rice to the markets. But if you didn't have your own vessel, you sent your rice or cotton over to Darien, where the ships would come in and transport it to the bigger markets or up to the Northeast, or even in some cases over to Europe. Most of the rice that was grown in South Carolina and Georgia, the vast majority of their rice went to the United Kingdom and the area around the Mediterranean Sea, which were big markets for American cultivated rice. Some of the rice was kept, of course, on the plantation, you know, to feed the people. And also some would be shipped, you know, to other parts of the South or up north. But most of the rice, I don't know what percentage, but certainly the majority of rice went overseas. By 1859, South Carolina and Georgia were the largest shippers of rice in the world. Something like 96% of all the rice cultivated on the planet was in South Carolina and Georgia. That's how big a deal rice was in those years before the Civil War. That's why they call it the Rice Kingdom. It's not called that for nothing. While Fanny and Pierce M. Butler were in Georgia in 1839, they became good friends with John Cooper of Cannon's Point, whose plantation was just across the marsh from Hampton Point on St. Simon's. This is the Cooper house on St. Simon's, where Fanny records in her journal that she spent some time visiting the Cooper family, who she liked very much. She took to John and Rebecca Cooper and their oldest son, James Hamilton Cooper. I think she was attached to them because they were far more liberal and humane slave owners than the Butlers and the Kings were, that she had already observed. So that's why I think she remained in close contact with them in the years after. Fanny only came to Georgia that one time, but she always stayed in touch with the Cooper family. She formed a close friendship with them. These are the tabby foundations of the Cooper house there at Cannon's Point, at the Cannon's Point Preserve, which is a wonderful ecological, historical, cultural, and archaeological resource that has been made available to the area through the generosity of a number of people. The Paulsons of Little St. Simon's and the Jones family of Sea Island, and among others, that have made this Cannon's Point Preserve such an important resource for all of us to enjoy. How many of you been to Cannon's Point? It's a great, great place to go to. It really is. They do special events there, and they have programming there from time to time, and guided ecological and archaeological tours and that sort of thing. Well, that's not a very happy couple, is it? That's Pierce M. on the left, and of course his wife, Frances, on the right, and they don't look very happy. And there's a reason for that, as you would expect. When they got back to Philadelphia after their sojourn here in Georgia of about 3 months, 4 months, they had a gradual falling out because of the slavery situation. And Fanny wanted him to give the freedom to the slaves long before, any emancipation movement was underway. And of course he refused. And so they had a falling out and eventually got a divorce in 1849, about 10 years after they came back from Georgia. But this is the only known photograph I've ever seen. Not a very good picture, obviously. Photography in the 1840s clearly had a lot of advances to make. But it does give you the feel for the climate between those two, as they were both a little older in life, and their children were teenage girls by then. And so, clouds are on the horizon. You can see it in their eyes. And of course, the famous journal was published in 1863. There was a reason for that. Pierce knew that Fanny had kept a record of all of the things that she'd seen on the plantations, and she wanted to publish those findings right away. But he said, no, do not, you can't do this, because that was in a day and age where, the husband got custody of children when they were minors. This was, before women's rights was even heard of. So even though Fanny was obviously a wonderful mother and a very decent and interesting and literate person, Pierce M. got custody of the daughters. And his threat was, I'll never let you visit the daughters if you publish this journal. And so that's why she held off publication of it until the two daughters reached the age of 21. And then when you're 21, even then you could do as you please. They no longer were under the father's thumb. So 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War, Fanny published her journal in London, and an edition was published about the same time in New York. And so it caused a sensation on both sides of the Atlantic, because it sensationalized and gave a first-hand accounting of the conditions of slavery, particularly on a very, very labor-intensive plantation like Butler Island. Rice planting is the most labor-intensive of all the plantation initiatives anybody could undertake. A lot of people, historians, earlier generations of historians have attributed the journal, along with Uncle Tom's Cabin, as being catalysts for keeping England out of the Civil War and not siding with the Confederacy. England depended on Southern cotton. We all knew that. But the journal had nothing to do with it. England had decided to stay out of it long before that. Probably Antietam, the Battle of Antietam, which was really a tactical draw, but Lee could no longer advance further into Pennsylvania. Gettysburg came later. But the English decided the South is not going to win this war. They don't have the industrial power that the North does. And so England decided to stay out of the war. I think Fanny's journal just kind of spurred that on in people's minds. It was a psychological thing. The journal was actually a series of letters to Fanny's friends in Massachusetts near Boston, where she had formed close friendships with people up in New England. Significant indictment of slavery. And of course, her portrayal of slavery was accompanied by her vivid natural history and ecological descriptions of our coastal area. It's in print. It's available in all the local bookstores, the journal, so I highly recommend it. In tandem with Major Butler's Legacy by Malcolm Bell, who is the definitive biography of all of the Butlers in their Georgia and Philadelphia lives. So both of them can be read together to really give you an ideal picture. Pierce M. Butler was not a very good manager. He was not a very good financier. He was unlike his grandfather. He was unlike even Roswell King Sr. He did not manage things. He wasted a lot of money. So by the 1850s, Pierce Butler had really lost tons of money through poor management and poor management decisions, not listening to his overseers, not taking their advice on proper management. And so as a consequence of that, Pierce M. Butler really was heavily into debt, exceedingly debt-ridden. This is a marker on Butler's Island, but I like this picture because it puts in context the story of the enslaved people with the rice stack in the background and, of course, the Houston house further back in the distance. But Pierce Butler had come to a point where he was going to have to get out from under the debt. So that's where the weeping time comes in. He made the decision he was going to have to sell off about half of his slave force, auction them off, in order to pay his debts off, his creditors. So this, of course, led to the great slave auction in Savannah at the 10-Breck Raceway in 1859. The largest slave auction in the United States. March of 1859. 436 men, women, and children. The marker says Butler and Hampton. I suspect, though, technically the majority of those slaves that were auctioned in Savannah came from Hampton, because by the late 1850s, Hampton was very unproductive, The cotton markets were very low and in slumps, and so the cotton plantation was losing the most money. So I suspect that the majority of those that were sold came from Hampton rather than Butler Island, although probably a good percentage did come from Butler Island. We know that. But I think the majority probably came from Hampton because of the fact that the cotton plantation then was so unproductive. And of course, it's become known traditionally as the weeping time because it broke up families. Children separated from their parents and husbands and wives separated. Naturally, there was a lot of emotional stress while that auction was going on. And so, hence the name Weeping Time, which has come to be known since. This is a period map showing where the slave auction was held at the 10-Breck Raceway. The Central Railroad of Georgia came through there. This where the slaves would be on the west side of Savannah, the west side of downtown Savannah, in that area where the Savannah Visitor Center is, and west of that, where the Railroad Museum and all of that is now. That would be where the auction was held. And so they had plantation owners come from all over the South, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, North Florida, to purchase Butler slaves at this auction of 436 human beings. It's one of the saddest times in the history of Georgia. 1859 was a big year. That was also the year of the Wanderer, the slave ship that landed a number of Africans on the beach or the rivers and creeks of Jekyll Island, brought directly from Africa to be sold. They caught them, the financiers of that initiative, because slavery, of course, was illegal. The importation of slaves into the United States was illegal after 1808. But that happened in 1859 as well as the weeping time. So that was a very, very difficult time, and all of this was like 2 years before the Civil War began. Yes?
Excuse me for interrupting, but got a plug in about the Wanderer. Jekyll Island is running a fantastic program on the Wanderer and the history of St. Andrews Beach from now to the end of September. If anybody wants to check that out.
Now, where is that being held?
Jekyll.
At the museum?
No, actually on the beach.
Oh, on the beach. Okay, I had not heard that. So keep an eye out for that. The beach, is it going to have a program about the Wanderer? Is it ongoing, or is it just a one-time thing?
It's going to go from now till September.
Oh, till September. Good. Okay. We'll keep an eye on that. Yeah. But speaking of the Wanderer, the Jekyll Island Museum in the historic district has a very good interpretation of the Wanderer situation. And they've got artifacts and nice interpretive displays and that sort of thing. So that would be a worthwhile visit. It was a terrible thing. The thing about it is, the paradox of all of this is this was 2 years before the war, 4 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. And so when the war was over, my understanding is that a lot of those slaves that were auctioned eventually made their way back home to this part of Georgia. Many were able to reunite with their families that had been dispersed here and there. So as tragic as it was, many of the former slaves were able to reconnect and get back together. But it was a very traumatic 4-year time or more for these people. Well, there is the aftermath, and I'm going to speed this up a little bit now that we're out of the plantation part of it. But after the war, Pierce M. Butler and his daughter Frances came back to Georgia from Philadelphia. He had plans to resume planting rice at Butler Island. Of course, the dynamics of labor had drastically changed. They were no longer free labor. So if you wanted to resume planting cotton or rice, you had to plan on paying wages to the workers, which they did. So in 1866, as early as 1866, Butler Island had a rice crop where Pierce and his daughter Frances hired many of the former slaves at Butler Island, paid them wages to go into the fields and plant rice. I would imagine that probably as many didn't as did, because when you've got your freedom, I wouldn't be in a hurry to go back into the rice fields. Who would? But if it was a means of making a living, then a lot of people, did that so they could support themselves and their families. Frances Butler, Fan, supported her father in the war effort, the South. The older sister, Sarah, Sally, supported the North with her mother, Fanny Kimball Butler. The good thing about that is they reunited after the war. The two sisters became very close. Both came very close to their mother again, Frances Ann Kimball Butler. But they were split by, like so many other families, were split by that war, where their loyalties lay. In the case of Frances, she did marry James Wentworth Lee on one of her trips to visit her mother in London. Frances met Reverend Lee. He was an Anglican priest, and they got married, fell for each other, got married. He was very interested in her history and her background, so Reverend Lee accompanied his wife back to Georgia after their marriage, and they lived for a time at Butler Island in the old overseer's house. Interestingly enough, the daughter, Frances, also wrote a book about her experiences of the conditions of the plantation and labor conditions after the war was over, and her experiences with trying to manage the plantation along with the assistance of her husband. So 10 years on a Georgia plantation since the war tells the story of the after the Civil War experiences on Butler Island, written by the daughter of Fanny Kimball. So that's very interesting. There's a photograph of Frances Butler about the time she married Reverend Lee. And there's her book, 10 Years on a Georgia Plantation. It was published in about 1883, and then has been reissued, like her mother's journal. It's been reissued a number of times since then. And there's Reverend Lee, very handsome young man. Reverend Lee is also memorable for the fact that he greatly supported the freed slaves in many ways, but one of the important things that he did was work hard to establish a place of worship for the freed people. So he got plans from England and helped the freed people of Butler Island and Darien build their own church called St. Cyprian's Church. And the St. Cyprian's Church, one of the most historic on the Georgia coast, was completed in 1876 through the efforts and support of Reverend James W. Lee, husband of Francis Butler. So there's a lot of paradoxes in here, isn't there? In this interesting story of these families. It really is. There's an early picture of St. Cyprian's. I wish it was in better focus. That's the best I could find. But it was built of wood and tabby there on Fort King George Drive, what's Fort King George Drive now, overlooking the Delta. Historic church. Services are held there regularly.
9 a.m. every Sunday.
There you go. Thank you, Reverend Bill. The beauty of St. Cyprian's, though, they have an interrelationship with St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, and I think that's important. I think it's also unique. The two churches that began as the white church and the African American church, years and years later came together, and so they formed, in essence, what became one congregation, and that's the beauty of that. So it's a wonderful tradition, and it's also an extension of our history, our cultural and our societal history in Darien and coastal Georgia. Sarah, the older daughter, married a man named Owen Wister, W-I-S-T-E-R. He was a Philadelphian. He was a doctor. She married him right before the Civil War broke out, and she and Owen, Mr. Wister, lived in Philadelphia, and were living there, and they had a son named Owen Wister, their son Owen Wister Jr., and that's Sarah in later life. Owen Wister became one of the best-known authors of American literature in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Owen Wister was quite well known for. So here you have another generation of writers, a third generation of this family become famous authors. Fanny Kemble, then Francis Butler Lee, and now Owen Wister. 3 generations in a row of well-known authors. I think it's remarkable. It's another aspect of this story that really is so unique. Owen Wister's best-known book was titled The Virginian. And it was in the parlance of our present day, it was a bestseller. If they had a New York Times bestseller list, I'm sure it was on there. He wrote a more controversial book later in the early 1900s called Lady Baltimore, which told the story of a slave-owning family in Charleston. And so I suspect that book did not go over as well. Malcolm Bell points out in his book about the Butler family that Owen Wister was a close friend of President Theodore Roosevelt. President Roosevelt also had coastal Georgia ties, as we all know. His ancestors came from Liberty County. But their friendship broke up when Lady Baltimore came out because it told a very controversial story of slave owners before the Civil War. And President Roosevelt did not like that. And so I think he wrote off that friendship with Owen Wister because of that book. Butler Island was eventually sold by the daughters, Frances and Sarah, to various owners, including the Strain family of Darien, owned Butler Island for several years. They owned it in the early 1900s, and the Strains sort of like made a feeble attempt to grow rice, not very successfully. By 1910 or so, rice cultivation had ended in Georgia and South Carolina. It was just no longer available. The industry had moved west to places like Arkansas and Louisiana and East Texas. So along comes this gentleman, T.H. Houston. Mr. Houston came from New York. This is a picture of him in his younger years. He was a wealthy New York financier. At one time, he was the half owner of the New York Yankees baseball team. And he heard that property was available in this area, so he bought Butler Island and neighboring Champneys Island in 1923. And he during his ownership, he spent a lot more time at Butler Island than the previous owners, the Butler family and all of them. He spent a lot of time, he and his wife spent a lot of time here in Georgia, usually mostly during the winter months. They would come down from New York, especially after they built the house in 1927. There he is in later life. This would be in the mid to late 1930s. Probably not long before Mr. Houston passed away. He died in 1938. And there you see them pictured on the steps of the house that they built, completed in 1927. This is the house that recently burned. Sitting here racking my mind. I know his wife's name and it's not coming. Anybody remember his wife's name? Unusual. It's an unusual name. That's why I can't think of it. Anyway, there they are pictured there, and they spent many happy winters at Butler Island, became closely allied with many of the citizens, black and white, of Darien. And he was, of course, the one who began the operations for the dairy, started a dairy operation, started growing truck crops, and became very entrepreneurial. In other words, here you go, 100 years later, Butler Island is once again sort of a plantation, although, you don't like to think of it as a plantation. It was a farming enterprise, I think is probably a more appropriate term. This is a front grounds of the house taken around 1935 or so, where you see something going on there. I don't know what the occasion of this gathering is, but that would be the house probably, 8 to 10 years after it had been completed. This is an aerial view, interesting picture, probably around 1940 or so. The house in the top there, the brick rice stack, the waterfront, one of the agricultural buildings there on the waterfront, no longer there. The remnants of the old sugar mill. This is at a time when Houston's dairy business was going full steam and was being very productive. How many people have a bottle like that, a milk bottle? I thought I was the only person in this county that didn't have one. Because every time I run into somebody like in the grocery store, I got one of those bottles. Now, I figured they were all over the place. But anyway, this is one of the Butler Island Dairy milk bottles. Pasteurized grade A milk, Butler Island Plantation. But this milk was marketed all over the eastern United States. It was a very successful enterprise. And there you see the old dairy building. That one's still standing, though, in much worse shape than you see it in that picture. But you see the cows lined up. I don't know what's going on there. Maybe they're selling cattle or buying cattle. I don't know what that. Selling cattle.
Selling.
Are you think those are dairy cows?
They're auctioning.
Okay. I think that's a real unique picture. I like that picture because it shows the dairy barn in very good condition compared to the present day. This is sort of a colorized version. It was obviously a black and white picture to start, but that's what is now 17, going right through the heart of Butler Island with the various buildings. Most of those buildings are no longer there. There's one of my favorite places growing up, the Shanty. Who in this room remembers the old Shanty restaurant? Oh, yeah.
My dad.
Okay. Yeah, well, I grew up here and ate many, many delicious hamburgers and milkshakes from the Shanty. Mr. Davis would make us kids, we'd go in there and get milkshakes and cheeseburgers. And the ham sandwiches. But the Shanty was right there on the edge of the highway, and it was, of course, there for the tourists, but also it was just sort of there to, to promote the Butler Island products. You could get the Butler Island milk and ice cream and all that sort of thing. It's another picture from probably about the same time as the previous picture. I would say around 1940-ish. Shortly before or after Mr. Houston died. Of course, he died in 1938, but the operations continued on for several years. They had, they hired managers, to come in and keep things going.
They actually shipped the flowers.
Yeah, they grew.
Different.
That's right, flowers. In 1948, this man, Richard J. Reynolds Jr. of North Carolina, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and owner of nearby Sapelo Island, Mr. Reynolds came and he bought Butler Island. The descendants of Mr. Houston put the island up for sale, and R.J. Reynolds bought Butler Island. And his plan was to continue the farming, the truck farming, and it became pretty prosperous for several years. This was in the aftermath of World War II when he bought Butler Island. So a lot of people were coming back from the war. Young black men and white men coming back from the war. If they didn't go into the shrimping business, they probably went to work on Butler's Island, doing all manner of jobs. And he had a very prosperous, they grew lettuce and cabbage and flowers and all kinds of stuff, marketed them all over the U.S., eastern U.S. How many of you read Hurry Sundown? This book came out in the early 60s with Butler Island as the focal point, as the central point. It was written by Bert and Katya Gilden of New York. K.B. Gilden is the combined authorship. They came to Darien and researched and talked to people and ended up writing about a 1,200-page, 2-volume novel called Hurry Sundown, which is the story, a fictionalized version of Butler Island and Darien in the aftermath of World War II and the conditions therein relating to race relations, civil rights, labor relations. And it's a difficult read, and it was not a bestseller because it's just from people that have told me that know about writing have told me it's an interesting story, but it's just not a well-written book. But it's still in print. You can find it. I'm sure it's in the libraries, if not the bookstores. So it also brings in the Episcopal Church, as Bill knows from reading it, and it ties all of this thing in together. But it was controversial at the time, and I was a kid when this book came out. And there was a lot of controversy about the time because the Gildens, of course, changed all the names, but they were modeled after many of them after real people in the book, including people like the Popple family and the judges and all of this sort of thing. And it was quite controversial at the time it came out. And I remember my grandmother and all of her friends in her bridge club, they spent half their bridge club when this book first came out. I remember listening to them. They were trying to put the names in the book to people they knew. So-and-so is actually so-and-so. Or this person, oh, she lives at Valona now, or whatever. But that's just part of growing up. I never forgot that. But anyway, my grandmother, when she passed away, she left me most of her books, and she had first editions of this book, which I still have. So from time to time, I'll go back and read Hurry Sundown. It's an interesting story if it's not that well written a book. Finally, Reynolds sold Butler Island to the state of Georgia in 1954, and this was at a period of time when the Georgia Game and Fish Commission, now known as Department of Natural Resources, began acquiring properties in the Altamaha Delta to establish a wildlife or a waterfowl refuge. And so Butler Island, Champneys, Broughton, Cambers, all these various areas in the Delta became waterfowl management areas for the Game and Fish Commission, which they remain to the present day under the present Department of Natural Resources Wildlife Management Division. So that's been the ownership of Butler Island since 1954, state-owned and managed, as Butler Island is right now. Well, that brings us to the present day and the sad occurrence a couple of weeks ago. And of course, I had virtually completed putting this program together when that event occurred. And of course, I had to add at least an image or two of that because to bring the story up to date. And of course, that's the house, almost 100 years old, 97-year-old house, the Houston house, burned, set on fire. I've heard it was arson and accidental. I don't know which is which. I don't know whether they've sorted all that out yet. That's neither here nor there. The house is gone. And it immediately conjured up memories that I had as a child of that house and spending hours in that house as a kid. Mr. and Mrs. Bryan, Herbert Bryan, Miss Eunice, you may remember Mr. Bryan, managed Butler Island for Mr. Reynolds for several years during the Reynolds ownership period. And they lived in the Houston house, and they had children about my age, so us kids would always get together, and usually on Saturdays, our parents all knew each other, and we'd play in the grounds and play in the house and explore the house, and it was, I was always in awe. I just, at that time, could not imagine a house being that big, because as a kid, you look at a huge place like that, and you think, my goodness. And that's the picture I like to remember of the house. And there it is, the aftermath of the fire a day or two later. Well, that's the way we remember the house in better times. I found this picture on the internet. The house looks very handsome with its paint job, and the grounds are well trimmed. So that's that. Any questions? Yes.
What was the chimney tower used for?
That was part of the rice mill, the pounding mill. The brick chimney was built before the Civil War, and they had a separate structure. It was powered by steam. It was a steam-powered rice mill that pounded the rice, and of course the stack was there to. The smoke would go out of the stack. So it was part of the rice processing equipment. Yes, ma'am.
My question has to do with the smokestack. What is being done to preserve that? Because I know it's become.
That what?
What is being done to preserve that? Because.
The stack?
Yeah, the stack.
Well, I was just talking to Bill Barton about that. You want to make a comment about the stacks?
Can I make a slightly longer comment?
Well, go ahead.
Councilman.
There's no error.
In 2019, with the support of the city of Darien, a resolution was introduced to the Georgia State House, House Bill 906, which would have allowed for the sale to private individuals in 15-acre lots of state historic sites, such as Butler Island, such as Fort King George. The city has a 50-year lease. We're about, 15 years into that? Thereabouts. But this would have allowed, in 15-acre increments, to carve out to go to private individuals, which would have privatized Butler Island. So a group of us got together. Sister Eunice was there, Councilman Watson was there at St. Cyprian's Church, and we fought against that. And the last day of the House meeting, the Senate meeting in 2020, it failed. So the question then was what to do with it, how to preserve it. And so we went to DNR and said, we'd like to raise money to begin to restore this site. And they asked us, rather than do that, to come in and do a historic structures report and a sea level rise report, which we did with the help of an $80,000 coastal incentive grant. We have all of that in addition to the restoration of those sites. It looked at it in 3 phases. What would it take to put it back and with an adaptive end use? We did a 10-year budget for maintenance. We knew how much would have to be put into it to maintain it. And one of those is the chimney, so the house is no longer here. But we have a complete assessment of all the historic structures, including the chimney, what it would take to put it back, what it's going to take to maintain it. All we need to do is the support of the city and some money from the state. I'm not asking the city to pay for it, it's expensive, but it can be done. And so all of that's been in place now for almost 4 years. And so that's there. We're just trying to get enough folks to be interested in it to maintain what's left of that site. When we say the house is burned, Butler Island is not. The house is gone. In reality, the least historic structure on the site. That chimney is almost 200 years old. It's a historic artifact. And so the cultural history, the history of that site remains, and it can be protected even though the house still isn't there. So let the city know, would that be an appropriate thing to do? that this is an important artifact and it should be kept open to the public and not privatized. So that's my elevator speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And I'll echo what Bill is saying there, because we need to protect our resources, our historic resources, before we lose them. And we've lost so much now over the years, and particularly our architectural heritage, and the lack of motivation for proper preservation of these historic resources. And that's not to blame any one person or group or individual or anything. It's the times in which we live. And so I'll echo Bill and say, I'll jump on the bandwagon myself. And that's why I'm doing programs like this, is to get out here and let's, beat the drums to do what we can to save these resources. Okay, I got 3 questions. Who was first?
Curious if the dairy barn and the shanty are part of the preservation?
Yes. All of that's, as Bill was saying, it's all the historic resource component together. Question here.
Well, for one, I'll say the shanty's gone. But Tom Fitzsimmons is working to restore.
Right, and Tom's doing a great work with that. Absolutely, that's great. Yeah, I think what Tom's doing. I was coming from Brunswick the other day, Tom, and I like that flag on there. That flag really. You had that up for the 4th, I guess, but that was. Yeah, and I just think it's. But Tom Fitzsimmons, yeah, I think we can't say enough about. Tom's an example of somebody to get stuff done. Without saying, what can I get out of it? He's one of those that says, nope, let's do something. And he's one of those that's doing it.
Let me make a plug for Jeff Ragsdale.
Okay.
Who actually started over at the dairy barn. Not to rebuild this dairy barn, but to actually stabilize it before it fell.
Right.
So he was kind of my incentive.
Right, good. Anything else? Yes.
Are you familiar with the play Shame of the Devil?
No.
It's a one-person play, and it's based on her writings and on her diary.
Okay.
I was curious if you knew how closely you followed it.
Okay.
It's the one Heather Heath does, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, Heather. I remember Heather used to do interpretations of Fanny Campbell. Does she still do that? Or?
Yes, she does. Every few years she does. I've tried to get her to come do it up here.
Yeah, it'd be great to get her to do a program either for LEHS or Ashantilly. Yep. Yes.
Try and get her up.
Just a quick question for clarification, because I'm trying to understand. Butler Island is in danger of privatization, or it's in the middle of the fight?
She's asking about the potential privatization of Butler Island. I can't answer that.
I think there's always pressure. I mean, developers want to come in and get undeveloped property to privatize it. I mean, that's an issue all along the coast, right? It's not just Butler Island.
Yeah.
So it's always that tension between public use. When the Reynolds Foundation, I have in 1943, the Saturday Evening Post, I have the original copy, did a spread during the war about Butler Island, and then I have an original attempt at bill of sale when the Reynolds Foundation tried to sell. They couldn't, so it ended up going to the state. But it went to the state as a heritage preserve open to the public. But those, cost money to do that, right? So there's always that tension. Developers want to come in. So we just have to see how that works and how it goes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Chip?
Did the Butlers ever own Broughton Island?
No, Broughton Island was a separate property. That property was owned originally by Henry Lawrence of South Carolina, and then it devolved into ownership of what became the Dent family of Hawthorne. The Brailsfords of Charleston bought Broughton and all of the property New Hope, what is now Hawthorne, in the early 1800s. And of course, what evolved from there was the George C. Dent and his descendants. And they all held Broughton and Hawthorne in that whole section. But Butler's never owned any. The Butlers owned part of General's Island for a long time. In fact, part of the sale of Butler by Francis and Sarah in the early 1900s included the sale of General's Island. General's is the island between Darien and Butler, for those of you that were wondering where that is. So, but that's the only contiguous property that the Butler family ever owned was General's Island.
Where did they take the boats from Butler's Island to get the Saints Island? And how long did it take?
There was the main landing of Butler Island was right there on the west side of the present bridge. going over to Butler's Island, near where the rice stack is.
Where did
And there would be a waterway route that they would take from there down to Hampton Point, going through Woodcut, past Broughton Island, down into what's known as Buttermilk Sound, and then you go into the Frederica River, and then branching off from that is the Hampton River.
how long would that have taken?
I think probably going with the tides, and they'd always use the tides. Wherever they were going or coming, the tides would be utilized. So probably from Butler to Hampton Point would be 2.5 to 3 hours on an outgoing tide by boat. Rowing. No motors in those days. Yeah, you understand, this is rowing. Paddling. Like us kids used to do. All right, one more.
Did you get Mr. Houston's wife's name?
The what?
Houston's wife, who were
What is it?
Lena Bell.
Lena Bell. Lena Bell. That's it. All right, one more. Yes.
Mr. Sullivan, I'm a new Darionite, and I'm very impressed with Butler Island. So when Major Butler passed away, how old was he, and why did he not leave that to his wife? And what was the contention between him and his son?
I don't know the details of that. I know he didn't get along with his son. I don't know why he didn't leave it to the wife. He left it to the daughter, who was the mother of the two brothers that changed their name to Butler.
Yes.
Because he and his son were, what's the term when a father and a son? Estranged, thank you, that's the term. The Major and his only son were estranged. Normally the property would have gone to them. But it didn't go to the wife, and I don't know whether there was a reason for that or not, I don't know.
Right.
But that's why it went to the daughter,
Right.
whose also name was Frances.
Yes.
And then, but the stipulation was the daughter wasn't going to get to keep it very long, because the will stipulated that it go to the grandsons when they attained their majority. Okay.
So, Buddy, in the way to talk about how the past is here with the present, Councilman Watson was instrumental in getting a fifth great-granddaughter of Roswell King here, a woman named Jane Vance, and her husband, a retired Episcopal priest. Griffin helped get her down here, and she knew nothing of the history that we know
Right.
of him, and she came down to see that.
Right.
And the fifth great-granddaughter of Colonel Houston, who now lives in Tampa, has been here several times out of the summer.
Good. Okay. I wasn't aware of that. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Griffin, I know Griffin has always been a great proponent and supporter of our local history. And I've worked with Griffin over the years on other projects and stuff. And so I know between Griffin and Miss Eunice and people like that, we're going to keep the fires burning and keep this story alive. Yes, ma'am.
Her descendants are in Roswell.
Who?
Jamie's,
Okay.
they are in Roswell.
Okay.
We have connections with them.
Okay. Connections with the Kings.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Paul.
Yeah, excuse me, buddy, but with the newfound attention to Butler because of the fire, a lot of people are reading about it and trying to learn about it. The thing that bugs me sometimes is you'll read where people believe that the house that burned was a plantation.
Right. Yeah, that's been a misconception. Yeah, a lot of people have asked me that over the years. You know, did Fanny Kimball live in that house? I mean, this is because these are people that don't know the history. So we do have to set the record straight. That Houston house was never a plantation house. It was always starting out as a winter residence for Mr. and Mrs. Houston. And then it evolved into, other families living there after the Houstons passed away. Even some of the management people for Georgia DNR, some of those families have lived in that house over in previous years, as part of the management of Butler Island. So,
Buddy, did Roswell King have any relationship with the tree plantation on the south end of St. Simon?
on the south end of where?
St. Simon.
Oh, I don't know that. I don't think so. But
The road that runs right.
You may be thinking of Thomas Butler King.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Thomas Butler King married Ann Page, and they owned Retreat on the south end of St. Simon's.
Which was also James Spaulding's back in the day.
And that was the previous plantation of Thomas Spaulding's father, James. But I think you probably think of Thomas Butler King, who owned Retreat with his wife Ann. I do a local history series for the Coastal Georgia Historical Society. And when we get into this period of time, people leave with their heads spinning because of the interrelationships, the genealogy of people like Kings and Spaldings and Coopers and on and on and on, Butlers. And it's so interconnected and so interrelated. And I have people that take these lectures and they're just scribbling furiously. And I say, it's all in the books. You don't have to write all this down. It's in the books, the more recent books. Yes, Griffin.
Yeah, it's more of a compliment. And I've lived long enough. It was 1954, and it's a compliment to Buddy for those that don't know him. It was DNI that took over in 1954.
Yeah.
70 years. A week ago, Bill, 70-year-old now, with the director of DNI, have an interest in what we have in preserving the Butler plantation. But it was Buddy, but his wife had died.
Yeah.
As a descendant, thanks to Eunice and Dr. Collins for letting me know of the Butler plantation. By names, I take care of some of the grave sites over there. So it was Buddy the one that taught me the art of marketing. I was saying all of the right things, but the wrong way. 3 decades ago, and I'll close with it because it's emotional. I've said this no less than about 100 times, but I've never said it to you. And he convinced me you need to write an article. I nearly cursed him out. I'm like, I'm not writing any articles. This government knows what we're doing to try to help people. And he said to me 3 or 4 times, and I listened to him. We did the article. And since that time, the first book ever written, and I'm far from a writer, on Butler Island as a descendant, I wrote it in 2007, 2009. Okay? And listening to him, I serve as the vice chairman now, vice chair of the United States of America. And I went through 3 presidents. And no one has fired me yet on the Gullah Geechee Culture Heritage Commission. I am, thanks to Bill and others, we do know they were going to sell it for what? $1. Remember that? Someone asked about it years ago. $1. I met the guy that was going to pay the dollar.
To put a distillery on it, to sell liquor to folks.
Yeah, they're going. In other words, there's going to be a big commercial operation.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's exactly. And if we were just to say, "Oh no, please."
The end of it is, it's because of Buddy. And I've said this about 100 times, but I've never said it to your face. I'm old and I'm subject to go any second now. But
Me too.
It was him that taught me the art of marketing. And from the same Fannie Kimball book 2 weeks ago, the fire was there. And on Congo Square in Louisiana with the federal government, we did a memorial because of the building. And we took one of Fannie Kimball's songs, drum roll, for marketing. And Nick from the folklore music, roots music for the whole United States, I'm on stage with him. We made the announcement because nobody's singing this song in the world. No Grass in Georgia came from the Fannie Kimball book. So we're going to pump new life into Butler Island because he taught me the art of marketing.
Thank you. Well, thank you for saying that, Griffin. It was purely unintentional. It's just my gift of gab, as I've been accused of. Talk too much.
He also carries the title as the ambassador.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Miss Eunice. Okay, Harriet, I'll turn it over to you.
No, thank you, Buddy. We just can't thank Buddy enough for all of these programs.
Thank you.
He will be doing the local history of Darien here this next winter. The dates are yet to be determined.